River Phoenix once swore I would never do drugs. Hollywood only taught him how to keep that promise on red carpets and break it in the shadows. Between the pounding bass of the Viper Room that Halloween night, only one voice cut through the chaos with devastating clarity. It's my brother. He's having seizures. In Hollywood, authenticity is currency. And that night, the market crashed completely, October 31st, 1993. The paramedics arrived to find River Jude Phoenix convulsing on the rain-slicked sidewalk outside Johnny Depp's infamous nightclub, his 23-year-old body rejecting the speedball of cocaine and heroin that would claim Hollywood's most genuine young star. The boy who had built his career on emotional transparency was dying from the very substances he had publicly condemned, his final performance an involuntary convulsion that no camera would ever capture. The official timeline reads like a coroner's report. 10:09 p.m., Joaquin Phoenix's 911 call is logged. 10:31 p.m., paramedics arrive to find River in full cardiac arrest. 1:51 a.m., he is pronounced dead at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. But between those clinical timestamps lies a story about what happens when sensitivity becomes a product, when authenticity becomes a brand, when the stage that once meant survival becomes the trap that ensures destruction. The forensic evidence would later reveal the precise cocktail that killed him. Lethal levels of cocaine and heroin, combined with traces of marijuana and Valium. But the real cause of death was far more complex. A systematic destruction of someone who had been performing since childhood, trading pieces of his authentic self for survival until there was nothing left but the role. This wasn't just another Hollywood overdose. This was the death of an entire mythology about pure hearts surviving corrupt systems, the final proof that good intentions are no match for an industry designed to monetize human vulnerability. The angel of Hollywood had fallen, but the questions surrounding his death revealed truths about fame, authenticity, and the price of being watched that remain as urgent today as they were on that Halloween night when America lost its most genuine star. To understand how someone so pure could fall so far, we must begin where all great tragedies begin, with a child who learned too young that survival depended on performance, and that authenticity could be traded for the coins that kept his family alive. Picture this foundational scene. Caracas, Venezuela, 1975. A 5-year-old boy with enormous eyes and an otherworldly sensitivity stands on a bustling street corner, his small hands wrapped around a battered acoustic guitar. At his feet lies an open guitar case, and as he begins to sing, his voice pure and heartbreaking, coins begin to fall with metallic whispers that will echo through the rest of his short life. This is River Jude Bottom's first performance, his first taste of the intoxicating power of making others feel something. His first lesson in the economics of authenticity. The tourists who stop to listen don't see a child being exploited. They see something beautiful, something that moves them in ways they can't articulate. A middle-aged American woman drops a crumpled $5 bill into the case, her eyes misting over at the purity of this child's voice. Such an angel, she whispers to her husband, not understanding that she's just purchased a piece of River's soul with her spare change. The boy doesn't understand it either, but his body learns the lesson. When he gives away his authentic emotion, people give him what his family needs to survive. River Jude Bottom, not yet Phoenix, entered the world on August 23, 1970 in a log cabin in Madras, Oregon, born to John Lee Bottom and Arlen Sharon Dunetz, two idealistic young people who believed in peace, love, and the transformative power of living off the grid. His parents were true children of the counterculture, drifting souls who had rejected conventional society in favor of a lifestyle that was equal parts spiritual quest and economic desperation. John Bottom was a gentleman whose dreams of being a musician had been deferred by the realities of raising a family in poverty. Arlen, who would later rename herself Hart, was the driving force behind the family's constant movement, always chasing the next spiritual revelation. the next community that might offer them the enlightenment they sought. Neither parent was equipped to protect their children from the psychological damage that would come from their choices, but both genuinely believed they were providing their offspring with something more meaningful than conventional suburban life. The family's journey from Oregon to South America wasn't motivated by wanderlust, but by religious fervor. They had joined the Children of God, a cult that preached sexual liberation and communal living while practicing psychological manipulation and child exploitation. For the bottom children, River, Rain, Joaquin, Liberty, and Summer, this meant a childhood defined by constant movement, extreme poverty, and the pressure to contribute to the family's survival from an almost impossibly young age. The cult's doctrine taught that traditional family structures were corrupt, that children belonged to the community rather than to their biological parents, that questioning authority was a form of spiritual weakness. River, as the eldest, absorbed these lessons most completely, learning to suppress his own needs and desires in service of the group's collective survival. The empathy that would later make him a great actor began here, as a hypervigilance born of the need to read the moods and desires of the adults around him to avoid punishment or abandonment. The street performances that began in Caracas weren't child abuse in the conventional sense, but they established a pattern that would define River's entire existence. His emotional availability, his ability to move people, his capacity for authentic vulnerability were resources to be harvested, currencies that could be traded for the family's survival. Before he could read properly, River had learned the most dangerous lesson any performer can learn: that love and survival were conditional on his ability to make others feel something. But it was also during these hardest years that River's extraordinary empathy began to manifest in ways that seemed almost supernatural. He couldn't walk past a stray dog without crying, refused to eat meat after witnessing the slaughter of a chicken, and would spend hours writing primitive songs about the pain he observed in the world around him. His sensitivity wasn't just emotional availability. It was a form of psychic permeability that made him vulnerable to every form of suffering he encountered. The other children in the cult noticed that River was different. Where they learned to protect themselves through emotional numbing or aggressive behavior, River seemed to absorb every trauma, every moment of adult dysfunction, every instance of cruelty or neglect. He became the family's emotional sponge, soaking up pain that belonged to others and carrying it in his small body like a collection of invisible wounds. When tourists or locals stopped to listen to the bottom children perform, River was always the draw. His siblings were talented in their own right, but River possessed something indefinable that made strangers stop in their tracks, reach for their wallets, and walk away feeling like they had witnessed something sacred. He was learning, without understanding it, that his pain could be transformed into beauty, and that beauty could be transformed into survival. The family's escape from the Children of God in 1977 should have been a liberation, but for River it simply meant trading one form of performance for another. Back in the United States, settling first in Florida and then in Los Angeles, the Bottom family changed their surname to Phoenix, a symbol of rebirth that would prove prophetic in the most tragic way possible. River's mother, now calling herself Heart Phoenix, was determined to transform her son's obvious gifts into a legitimate career, driving him to auditions around Los Angeles in their broken-down van with evangelical conviction that his talent would save them all. The transition from cult life to mainstream American society was jarring for all the Phoenix children, but particularly difficult for River, who had spent his formative years learning to suppress his individual identity in favor of collective survival. Now he was being asked to develop and market that individual identity, to become a brand, to turn his sensitivity into a commodity that could be sold to the entertainment industry. Heart Phoenix's approach to managing her son's career was simultaneously protective and exploitative. She genuinely believed that River's talent was a gift that could lift the entire family out of poverty, but she also pushed him relentlessly, scheduling audition after audition, teaching him to smile on command and cry on cue, transforming his natural empathy into a professional skill set. The stage that had once been a literal street corner became the auditioning rooms of Hollywood. But the fundamental dynamic remained unchanged. River's worth was measured by his ability to access and display authentic emotion on command. The agents and casting directors who saw him immediately recognized something rare, not just natural charisma or good looks, but an emotional transparency that was extraordinary in adult actors, let alone children. The early television work came in a steady stream. Commercials for breakfast cereal where his genuine smile sold thousands of boxes, guest appearances on family shows where his ability to cry real tears made audiences reach for their tissues. Small roles in after-school specials where his portrayal of troubled youth seemed to come from some deep well of personal understanding. Each job paid a few hundred or a few $1,000s, enough to keep the Phoenix family afloat but never enough to provide real security. River's relationship with performing during this period was complicated by his growing awareness that his emotional availability was simultaneously his greatest asset and his greatest vulnerability. He could access genuine feeling on command, but every time he did so for the cameras, he was essentially selling a piece of his inner life to strangers. The boy who had learned on the streets of South America that authenticity was currency was now learning in the studios of Los Angeles that authenticity was also exhaustible. The breakthrough role that would change everything came through a combination of talent and timing. Rob Reiner was casting Stand By Me, looking for 4 young actors who could embody the complex relationships of boys on the edge of adolescence, dealing with friendship, mortality, and the loss of innocence. When River auditioned for the role of Chris Chambers, he brought not just acting ability but lived experience of poverty, family dysfunction, and premature responsibility that made his performance feel achingly real. The role that transformed survival through performance into living to perform came in 1986 when director Rob Reiner cast 15-year-old River as Chris Chambers in Stand By Me. The character seemed written specifically for him, a tough kid from the wrong side of the tracks with a heart of gold and dreams of escaping his circumstances. River inhabited the role with an intensity that amazed his co-stars, finding in Chris Chambers a reflection of his own complex relationship with childhood poverty and the price of growing up too fast. The filming of Stand By Me was transformative for River in ways that went beyond professional success. For the first time in his life, he was working with other young people who understood the pressures of performing, who shared his struggles with balancing authenticity and commercial demands. His co-stars, Jerry O'Connell, Corey Feldman, and Will Wheaton, became genuine friends, creating a supportive environment that allowed River to explore his craft without the constant pressure of family expectations. But even this positive experience came with costs. The emotional demands of the role required River to access memories and feelings that he had been suppressing since childhood. Chris Chambers' pain was River's pain, filtered through the lens of Stephen King's storytelling but rooted in genuine trauma. Night after night, River would return to his trailer emotionally drained, having given everything of himself to the cameras, learning that great acting required a level of self-excavation that was both artistically fulfilling and psychologically dangerous. The film's success made River famous overnight, but it also cemented his role as the Phoenix family's primary breadwinner. At 15, he wasn't just supporting his parents and siblings, but an extended network of hangers-on who had attached themselves to the family's rising star. The boy who had once sung for coins on street corners was now performing for millions of dollars. But the fundamental equation remained the same. His value to others was entirely dependent on his ability to keep working, keep earning, keep being the perfect young actor that Hollywood demanded. The pressure of carrying his entire family's financial stability would have been overwhelming for an adult. But for a teenager still figuring out his own identity, it was crushing. River began to develop a form of dissociation where he could separate his professional self from his private self, performing the role of successful young actor, while his authentic personality retreated further and further into hiding. Friends from this period describe him as having two distinct personas: the charming, articulate River who appeared in interviews and at industry events, and the quiet, often melancholy boy who emerged when the cameras stopped rolling. The money that success brought should have provided security, but instead it created new forms of anxiety. River was generous to a fault, unable to say no to family members who needed financial help, friends who wanted to borrow money, or charities that sought his support. He had learned early that his worth was tied to his ability to provide for others, and even as his bank account grew, he felt constantly on the verge of not having enough, not being enough, not doing enough to justify the love and approval he craved. Picture this defining moment: the 1989 Academy Awards ceremony, where 18-year-old River Phoenix sits in the audience wearing an uncomfortable tuxedo, his long hair slicked back in a style that feels like costume. He's been nominated for Best Supporting Actor for his devastating performance in Running on Empty, making him one of the youngest nominees in Oscar history. When the camera finds him, his smile is radiant, but his eyes carry a weight that seems impossible for someone so young. This was River at his absolute peak, critically acclaimed, commercially successful, beloved by audiences and respected by industry veterans. But the success that should have felt like vindication instead felt like another trap. The boy who had grown up believing that art could change the world was discovering that success in Hollywood often meant becoming complicit in the very systems he had hoped to reform. The Oscar nomination for Running on Empty came with a level of scrutiny that River found overwhelming. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what he thought about everything, what causes he supported, what his plans were for the future. The media had decided that he represented a new generation of conscious actors, and he felt obligated to live up to that image even when it felt artificial and constraining. In Running on Empty, River played Danny Pope, a boy whose family has been living underground since the 1960s, constantly moving to avoid capture by the FBI. The parallels to his own childhood were impossible to ignore: the constant movement, the family loyalty that required personal sacrifice, the struggle to maintain identity while living under assumed names. His performance was so authentic that it seemed less like acting than like documentary footage of his own life. The films from this period showcase River's extraordinary range. Running on Empty, where his portrayal of a boy forced to abandon his identity to protect his family, earned him that Oscar nomination. The Mosquito Coast, where he held his own opposite Harrison Ford in a tale of idealistic obsession. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where he played young Indy with a combination of vulnerability and determination that captured the character's essential spirit. Each performance demonstrated his unique gift for accessing genuine emotion. But that gift was also becoming his curse. To deliver the kind of authentic vulnerability that made him special, River had to keep himself emotionally raw. But staying raw in an industry built on illusion and exploitation was like trying to survive with an open wound. The very sensitivity that made him a great actor made him vulnerable to every form of manipulation Hollywood had to offer. The relationship with Martha Plimpton, which began during the filming of Running on Empty, offered River his first taste of what young love might feel like when it wasn't complicated by family dynamics or professional obligations. Plimpton was an actress herself, someone who understood the pressures of the industry while maintaining a sense of independence that River found both attractive and intimidating. But even their romance was conducted under the harsh lights of public scrutiny. Every date became a photo opportunity, every private moment potentially fodder for tabloid speculation. River, who had been performing since childhood, found it increasingly difficult to separate authentic affection from the performance of being in love for the cameras. The relationship that should have been a refuge became another stage, another place where he had to be on for an audience. The money that had once represented freedom began to feel like chains. Every dollar earned came with obligations, family support, career expectations, the constant pressure to make choices based on commercial considerations rather than artistic or moral ones. River began turning down lucrative projects that conflicted with his values, but this only increased the financial pressure on a young man who had been supporting an entire extended family since childhood. The activism that had once felt natural and essential began to feel calculated and performative. River had been genuinely committed to environmental causes, animal rights, and social justice since childhood. But as his fame grew, his convictions became part of his brand. Magazine articles described him as Hollywood's most conscious young star, and he felt obligated to live up to that image even when it required him to speak about issues with a certainty he didn't always feel. The turning point came when River began to understand that his authenticity had been commodified, packaged, and sold as River Phoenix, the conscious young actor. Every interview required him to perform a version of moral purity that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Every public appearance demanded the kind of emotional availability that he could no longer access without chemical assistance. The boy who had once been genuinely committed to environmental and social causes found himself performing his convictions rather than living them. The irony was devastating. The more successful he became as an authentic performer, the more inauthentic his daily life became. He was trapped in a performance of authenticity that required him to suppress the very qualities that had made him authentic in the first place. The sensitivity that had once been his greatest strength was becoming his greatest weakness, making him vulnerable to every form of exploitation and manipulation that the industry had to offer. The collaboration with Gus Van Sant on My Own Private Idaho should have been River's artistic breakthrough, the project that finally allowed him to channel his gifts into something that mattered. Van Sant was drawn to River's combination of raw talent and obvious pain, recognizing in him the perfect embodiment of Mike Waters, a narcoleptic street hustler searching for his mother and some form of genuine connection. The film was groundbreaking in its honest portrayal of male sexuality and the economics of intimacy, themes that resonated deeply with River's own experience of having his emotional availability commodified since childhood. Playing Mike Waters allowed him to explore parts of himself that had never been acknowledged in his more mainstream roles, to access vulnerability without having to package it for mass consumption. Picture this crucial scene. After a particularly intense take, the cameras stop rolling, but River remains in character, tears still streaming down his face, unable or unwilling to step back into his everyday persona. The line between River Phoenix, the actor, and Mike Waters, the character, has dissolved completely, and everyone on set recognizes they're witnessing something both beautiful and terrifying. A young man so committed to authentic performance that he can no longer protect himself from the emotions he's channeling. The relationship with Keanu Reeves that developed during filming was one of the few genuine friendships River had experienced since childhood. Reeves was also struggling with the pressures of fame, but he had developed better boundaries, better ways of protecting his authentic self from the demands of public life. River was drawn to Keanu's ability to remain essentially himself despite the pressures of celebrity, but he couldn't figure out how to replicate that self-protection in his own life. This was the paradox that would ultimately destroy him. The very sensitivity that made him extraordinary also made him unable to survive the industry that celebrated that sensitivity. He had become a method actor by necessity, accessing real pain to fuel his performances, but he lacked the psychological barriers that protected other actors from being consumed by the roles they played. The music that had always been his refuge, his band Alika's Attic, represented everything pure about his artistic impulses, also became complicated by his fame. Record labels wanted to sign the band not because they believed in the music, but because they saw an opportunity to exploit River's celebrity in another medium. Even his most personal form of expression was being turned into product. The songs River wrote during this period reflect his growing awareness of his situation. Lyrics about feeling trapped in other people's expectations, about the impossibility of being authentic in an industry built on illusion, about the exhaustion that comes from constantly performing your own identity. The music was his attempt to find a voice that belonged entirely to him. But even that sanctuary was being invaded by commercial considerations. It was during this period that the drugs entered his life as more than recreational experimentation. What began as creative aids, something to help him access deeper emotions, something to help him come down after intense scenes, became daily necessities. The boy who had publicly declared that he would never do drugs was privately discovering that substances were the only way he could manage the anxiety of living every moment as a performance. The progression was gradual and seemingly rational. A little something to help with anxiety before auditions, something else to help him sleep after emotionally draining shoot days, something to help him feel normal at parties where everyone expected him to be on. Each substance served a specific function in helping him manage the gap between his public and private selves, but collectively they were creating a dependency that would prove impossible to overcome. Picture the most haunting scene from this period. River in a recording studio in Gainesville, Florida, where he had retreated to work on Alika's Attics album. Between takes, he leans into the microphone and says quietly, almost to himself, "Life is short. Let's play it true." The words capture both his deepest aspiration and his growing awareness that authenticity might be the one thing he could no longer access without chemical assistance. The move to Gainesville was meant to be a fresh start, a chance to get clean away from the temptations of Los Angeles and reconnect with the activism that had once given his life meaning. River purchased land there, planning to create an environmental sanctuary where he could live according to his values rather than his public image. For brief periods, the plan seemed to work. Friends from this time describe a different River, calmer and more grounded. Someone who could have conversations about the future without the haunted expression that had become his signature. But the patterns established over years of using drugs to manage overwhelming empathy and career pressure were not easily broken by geographical change. Even in Florida, even with genuine intentions and periods of sobriety, River found himself drawn back to substances that had become his primary method of emotional regulation. The stage that had once been a tool for survival had evolved into an emotional dependency that required chemical management. The relationship with Samantha Mathis, which began in 1992, represented River's last serious attempt at finding genuine intimacy outside the entertainment industry. Mathis was an actress herself, but she had maintained better boundaries between her public and private selves, and River was drawn to her ability to remain grounded despite the pressures of fame. But River's addiction was becoming increasingly difficult to hide, even from those closest to him. Mathis later described watching him struggle with the gap between his public image as a clean-living activist and his private reality as someone who needed chemical assistance to function. She could see that he was drowning, but she also understood that his dependency wasn't recreational. It was existential, a way of managing the fundamental contradiction between who he was and who the world needed him to be. The final year of River's life was marked by increasingly erratic behavior that reflected his growing inability to maintain the performance of being River Phoenix. Projects fell through when he failed to show up for meetings or arrived too impaired to work. Directors who had once fought to cast him began to view him as unreliable, despite his obvious talent. The gap between his public image and private reality had become so wide that he was essentially living two completely separate lives. In public, he was still the conscious young actor, the environmental activist, the boy who had grown up different and maintained his values despite Hollywood's corrupting influence. In private, he was someone who could barely function without chemical assistance, who had become so disconnected from his authentic self that he could no longer access it without pharmaceutical intervention. October 30th, 1993, River returns to Los Angeles for professional commitments, re-entering the orbit of people and places that had both made and destroyed him. Within 24 hours, the progress he had made in Florida begins to evaporate like morning mist, and the boy who had once promised to change Hollywood prepares for his final performance. The final day of River's life began like many others in recent months, with good intentions undermined by the chemical dependencies that had become necessary for his survival. He had meetings scheduled, people to see, obligations to fulfill. But the returning to Los Angeles had triggered all the old patterns, all the old associations between the city and the substances that made it bearable. 9:30 p.m., October 31st. River Phoenix arrives at the Viper Room with girlfriend Samantha Mathis, brother Joaquin, and sister Rain. Witnesses later describe him as appearing agitated but not obviously intoxicated. The club, owned by Johnny Depp and frequented by Hollywood's young elite, is packed for Halloween night. The air thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of desperate energy that comes from people trying too hard to have fun. The Viper Room was typical of the venues that had become River's refuge in recent years, dark enough to hide in, exclusive enough to keep out most fans and paparazzi, filled with other people who understood the pressures of fame and didn't expect him to be on all the time. It was one of the few places where he could feel something approaching normal, where he could just be another young person trying to have fun rather than a symbol of conscious living. 9:45 p.m. He joins friends at a corner table in the club's dark interior, his movements already showing the first signs of the chemical cocktail that will kill him within hours. The Viper Room's red velvet walls and dim lighting create the perfect atmosphere for the kind of transactions that happen in shadows, where people sell and buy the substances that make fame bearable. The exact sequence of events that led to River's fatal overdose remains disputed. But what is clear is that sometime during this period he consumed a speedball, a combination of cocaine and heroin that provides an intense high followed by a catastrophic crash. Whether this was intentional or accidental, whether he knew what he was taking or was deceived about its contents, has never been definitively established. 10 p.m. Security cameras capture River's last clear image, leaning against a wall near the club's entrance, speaking intensely with an unidentified individual. What they discuss will never be known, but within minutes, River will have consumed the speedball that ensures he will never leave the club alive. The person he's speaking with appears to be someone he knows, someone he trusts enough to accept whatever they're offering. This transaction, captured in grainy black and white footage, represents the final exchange in a life built on transactions. Authenticity for survival, sensitivity for money, genuine emotion for public approval, and finally trust for the chemicals that promise to make it all bearable. 10:09 p.m. The chemicals begin to war in River's system, the cocaine accelerating his heart while the heroin suppresses his breathing. The contradiction is too much for his body to handle, and he begins to convulse. Joaquin Phoenix's 911 call is logged. "Please, please, he's having seizures. Get over here. Please, please, get over here." The panic in his voice transforms River's final moments into public record, a young brother's anguish preserved forever on emergency dispatch recordings that would be played endlessly in the media coverage that followed. 10:15 p.m. River is carried outside by club security, convulsing violently on the rain-slicked sidewalk while onlookers take photographs that will appear in tabloids around the world. The Halloween night that was supposed to be about costumes and pretense becomes the night when all pretense is stripped away. When the boy who had been performing since childhood gives his final involuntary performance on a public street, Samantha Mathis later describes his condition as like nothing I'd ever seen before. His whole body was rejecting something. The image of River Phoenix dying on the sidewalk outside the Viper Room would become one of the defining moments of 1990s celebrity culture, proof that fame was no protection against the forces that destroyed people from the inside out. 10:31 p.m. Paramedics arrived to find River in full cardiac arrest. Efforts at resuscitation begin immediately but prove futile. The cocaine has accelerated his heart beyond its capacity while the heroin has suppressed his respiratory system. A chemical contradiction that his young body cannot survive. 1:51 a.m., November 1st. River Phoenix is pronounced dead at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Halloween becoming the night that Hollywood lost its most authentic young star. The coroner's report would reveal the precise chemistry of his destruction. Lethal levels of cocaine and heroin, combined with traces of marijuana and Valium. But the report couldn't explain how a young man who had built his public persona around clean living and conscious choices had ended up consuming this deadly combination. The gap between River Phoenix, the public figure, and River Phoenix, the private person, had become so wide that even those closest to him struggled to reconcile the boy they knew with the circumstances of his death. Who provided the drugs that killed him? Was this intentional self-destruction or a tragic accident? Why were the final hours of his life shrouded in such mystery that even now, decades later, key details remain unclear? These questions persist not because they matter to River, he was beyond caring, but because they reveal truths about an industry that had learned to monetize authenticity while remaining fundamentally hostile to anything genuinely authentic. The media coverage that followed River's death was both respectful and exploitative, celebrating his talent while sensationalizing his struggles with addiction. The same magazines that had praised him as Hollywood's most conscious young star now dissected every detail of his final night, turning his death into entertainment for the same audiences who had consumed his performances throughout his short career. Picture that final heartbreaking scene. A hospital room at Cedars-Sinai where River Phoenix's body lies still, finally at peace after a life spent in constant performance. His family gathers around him, not the Phoenix family of Hollywood mythology, but the Bottom family who had loved River Jude before he became a product, before his sensitivity became a brand, before his authenticity became currency. The funeral in Gainesville, Florida, was everything that River's Hollywood life had not been. Small, private, focused on the person rather than the persona. His family buried him under his birth name, River Jude Bottom, reclaiming him from the industry that had transformed him into a commodity. The gravestone bears no mention of his filmography or achievements, just his name, his dates, and the simple inscription, Son of Heart Phoenix. The choice to bury him as River Jude Bottom rather than River Phoenix was deliberate and profound, a way of separating the person from the persona, the boy who had sung on street corners for coins from the movie star who had died from the pressures of fame. In death, his family was able to give him something that had been impossible in life, the right to be himself rather than what others needed him to be. Joaquin Phoenix, who had witnessed his brother's death and carried that trauma forward, chose to honor River's memory by pursuing the kind of uncompromising artistic integrity that River had always aspired to. In interviews years later, he would describe River not as a cautionary tale about drugs, but as someone who gave too much of himself to an industry designed to take everything. The impact on the Phoenix family was devastating and transformative. Hart Phoenix struggled with guilt over the choices she had made in managing River's career, wondering whether her determination to lift the family out of poverty had ultimately cost her eldest son his life. The surviving children each dealt with River's loss differently, but all of them carried forward his commitment to using their platform for causes larger than themselves. The music from Aleka's attic sessions was eventually released, revealing songs that capture River's voice in its purest form. No cameras, no directors, no expectations beyond the desire to create something beautiful. Listening to these recordings today, you can hear both his extraordinary talent and his growing awareness that authenticity had become the one thing he could no longer afford. The songs reveal a young man grappling with questions about identity, authenticity, and the possibility of living according to one's values in a world that seemed designed to corrupt those values. The lyrics are often cryptic and metaphorical, but they consistently return to themes of performance, the search for genuine connection, and the exhaustion that comes from constantly being someone other than yourself. River Phoenix died because authenticity became currency in his world, and he paid for others' emotional experiences with pieces of his genuine self, until nothing remained but the performance. He wasn't destroyed by drugs. He was destroyed by an industry that had learned to harvest human sensitivity for profit, that treated emotional availability as a renewable resource, that convinced a sensitive boy that his worth was measured by his ability to make others feel something. When authenticity becomes a product, the authentic person always pays the price. River's death wasn't just the loss of a talented actor, it was the inevitable result of a system that commodifies human vulnerability and then acts surprised when the vulnerable person can't survive the transaction. The boy who once stood on a street corner in Caracas, singing for coins while his family waited nearby, had learned the most dangerous lesson of all: that survival depended on performance, that love was conditional on entertainment, that authenticity was just another form of currency to be spent until the account ran dry. In the years that followed, River's story would be told and retold, each generation finding in his brief life a reflection of their own anxieties about fame, authenticity, and the price of success. He became a cautionary tale about the dangers of child stardom, a symbol of what happens when sensitivity is treated as a commodity, and a reminder that some forms of authenticity are simply too expensive to sustain in a world that views human emotion as entertainment. What hidden truths about the cost of fame and the price of being authentic might River Phoenix's story still reveal to those brave enough to look beyond the tragedy? His life and death continue to ask the hardest questions about success, art, and the human cost of entertaining others. Questions that remain as urgent today as they were on that Halloween night when Hollywood learned that some forms of authenticity are simply too expensive to sustain.